The individual known to history as Joseph Vissarionovich Jugashvili, or Joseph Stalin, entered the world on December 18, 1878, in the eastern Georgian town of Gori. His father, Bessarion Jugashvili, was a cobbler who initially enjoyed a prosperous business. However, he failed to adapt to changing trends, and his shoes eventually fell out of fashion, leading to his family's impoverishment. Joseph's mother, Ekaterina Galadze, was a devout Orthodox Christian who married Bessarion at 16 and subsequently gave birth to 3 sons. The 2 eldest sons died in infancy, resulting in Ekaterina placing considerable hope for the future on her sole surviving son. It is evident that Joseph's parents had a tumultuous relationship, frequently arguing and clashing over their son's future. Ekaterina desired him to join the priesthood, while Bessarion insisted he become a cobbler. When Joseph was 10, Ekaterina left Bessarion, who had become an abusive alcoholic. On his infrequent visits home, he would beat his wife and son, on one occasion inflicting such a severe thrashing on Joseph that he experienced hematuria for a week. To escape her husband, Ekaterina sought the assistance of a family friend, Yakov Ignatashvili, who had been the best man at her wedding to Bessarion and the godfather of her 2 deceased sons. This acquaintance enabled both mother and son to reside in relative safety for a period. To make ends meet, Ekaterina undertook housework for friends in the local vicinity, including a priest named Christopher Charkviani, who later assisted in securing Joseph a place at the Gori Church School in 1888. There he demonstrated his capabilities as a student and quickly ascended to the top of his class. Despite this improvement in fortune, Joseph was nearly denied the opportunity for further advancement in life. Around this time, he narrowly survived a smallpox epidemic, which left his face pockmarked. He also had another close brush with death soon after, when his left arm was mangled in the wheel of a horse-drawn cart, leaving it withered for the remainder of his life. After recovering, Joseph continued to excel academically, but also acquired a reputation for fighting and misbehaving with his classmates. Despite his unruly nature, his teacher soon recommended him for admission to the spiritual seminary school at Tbilisi, and he was finally admitted in 1894. Following this, Joseph continued to perform admirably, even having some of his poetry published in local newspapers. However, his performance soon deteriorated sharply after he began openly declaring his atheism in class and frequently disrespecting the local monks. This disdain for the established order intensified when Joseph began reading forbidden publications, such as Nikolai Chernyshevsky's renowned novel, What Is to Be Done, and The Notorious Capital by Karl Marx, of whom he subsequently became a great admirer. Joseph then joined clandestine socialist workers' meetings within Georgia, as resentment and anger were escalating in the region against the oppressive Russian Tsarist government. Soon after, he became active in the local resistance and consequently left the spiritual seminary school. By the close of the 19th century, the Romanov dynasty had governed Russia with an iron fist for 3 centuries. Although various endeavors had been made to modernize the nation, it still lagged behind its Western counterparts, as its economy remained primarily agrarian rather than industrial. At this time, a third of Russia's 126 million inhabitants were living in serfdom, even though it had been officially abolished in 1861. The vast majority of the populace also endured abject poverty and had little or no opportunity for education or advancement, spending their lives toiling the land or serving in the military. The country's government was also highly centralized during this period, with ultimate authority vested in the czars, who exercised near-total control over virtually every facet of Russian life. They, along with the deeply conservative Orthodox Church, had governed the Russian people's hearts and minds from time immemorial. However, this grip on power was beginning to weaken by the time of Stalin's birth, as resentment within the country was reaching a boiling point. This was fueled by technology such as printing presses, becoming increasingly widespread, which meant that when restrictions on the press were lifted in 1912, the reality of contemporary affairs became accessible. Until 1894, this had been Tsar Alexander III. Alexander had ascended to the Russian throne in 1881, following the assassination of his own father, Alexander II, arguably the most liberal of the czars. He was killed by socialist radicals in a bomb attack just prior to announcing the creation of a parliament within the Russian state, designed to grant the populace a greater voice in governance. Enraged by his father's death, Alexander III discarded his father's reforms and initiated an authoritarian crackdown on the country, extinguishing any hope of a more libertarian Russia. This decision, more than any other, would later unleash widespread resentment and animosity across the nation. However, as Alexander III was a strong and capable czar, the probability of revolution was low, as any discontent was ruthlessly suppressed as soon as it emerged. Then in 1894, Alexander III died unexpectedly from kidney disease at the relatively young age of 49. He was succeeded by his timid and inexperienced son, Nicholas II, who possessed average intellect and was nowhere near as capable or ruthless as his late father. Nicholas then perpetuated Alexander's authoritarian policies, but as he lacked the capacity or willpower to implement them effectively, unrest and revolution soon began to manifest. Over the ensuing 2 decades, the Tsar's incompetence and weakness gradually allowed those within the country, now hardened by oppression and filled with animosity towards their plight, to rise up and overthrow the Romanov dynasty. Georgia had itself been integrated into the Russian Empire since 1801, but had, since the assassination of Alexander II, been relegated to the status of a mere colony. Restrictions were imposed on its populace, such as the learning of the Georgian language. This inevitably only fueled the flames of resentment within Georgia over the subsequent decades and also created the ideal conditions for the proliferation of radical, anti-establishment ideologies. In 1899, Joseph commenced employment as a meteorologist in Tbilisi, a relatively undemanding and stress-free occupation. This allowed him to dedicate more time to reading revolutionary literature while at work, and he soon developed an even more intense hatred and opposition to the Tsarist regime, as well as the Orthodox Church. During this period, Joseph also began delivering lectures to local workers and attending clandestine meetings, where he orchestrated strikes in local factories. This inevitably attracted the attention of the Tsar's secret police, or Okhrana. To evade arrest, he went into hiding, subsisting on the charity of his friends and socialist supporters. Joseph then joined the nascent Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP, in 1899. This was a left-wing socialist movement founded in 1898 that would eventually evolve into the Communist Party in 1912. The tactics employed by the party often involved infiltration and agitation, where members would secure employment in local factories and subsequently incite opposition against the workers' employers, as well as the local authorities. This would then lead to strikes and demonstrations, often culminating in clashes with the local police. Joseph was particularly adept at this form of agitation, or rabble-rousing, and he soon established himself as one of the more radical or hardline members of the party. He had a reputation for advocating the use of violence, a tactic he would come to master over the coming years. He then ascended rapidly within the Tbilisi branch of the RSDLP and assisted in organizing further strikes in the local area. This resulted in his nomination to join the committee of the local party in 1901. However, fearing arrest, he relocated to Batumi on the Black Sea coast, where he again organized protests. At one of these protests, numerous individuals were shot by the local police. A year later, Joseph was implicated in the instigation of an assault on a local prison where several party leaders were incarcerated, during which over a dozen of the attackers were killed. After organizing yet another protest on the day of his comrades' funerals, he was apprehended and sentenced in 1903 to 3 years of exile in Siberia. At the time, this was not a death sentence in all but name, as it would later become. People were sent to Siberia as punishment for a defined period, after which they could return. However, Joseph would later utilize this punishment as one of his instruments of terror, ordering the exile of millions of dissidents, political adversaries, and class traitors to labor camps in the frigid. Despite being exiled, Joseph had no intention of adhering to its duration and eventually managed to return to Tbilisi. There, he assisted in editing an underground newspaper called The Proletarian Struggle, in which he advocated for the Georgian branch of the RSDLP to secede from the Russian branches, as he was becoming disillusioned with the movement's methods and objectives. Conversely, the Mensheviks contended that worker productivity would be enhanced if a degree of private ownership was maintained. Joseph, himself a hardliner and proponent of violence, naturally aligned himself with the Bolsheviks as he harbored animosity towards many local Menshevik party members within Georgia, who were also in the minority. Then on January 22, 1905, at a mass protest in St. Petersburg, Tsarist troops opened fire on thousands of unarmed civilians, resulting in hundreds of deaths and many more injuries. This triggered widespread unrest and civil disorder throughout the nation, which would become known as the 1905 Revolution. In Georgia itself, rioting and ethnic violence erupted between various groups, prompting Joseph to form the Bolshevik Battle Squad. With this squad, he undertook robberies, raided arms caches, stole printing equipment, and assaulted government troops. Having now established himself as a leader within the Bolsheviks in Georgia, Joseph was dispatched in November 1905 to St. Petersburg, where a party conference was underway. It was at this gathering that Joseph would encounter Vladimir Lenin for the first time. A year later, he journeyed to the Swedish capital, Stockholm, to attend the Fourth Congress of the RSDLP. At this Congress, a vote was taken to restrict the raising of party funds to peaceful means only, a measure opposed by both Lenin and Joseph. They subsequently resolved to continue with their armed robberies regardless. Consequently, Joseph intensified his campaign of violent robberies, culminating in him planning, alongside Lenin, a notorious robbery involving an armed convoy in Tbilisi, carrying a substantial sum of money to the Imperial Bank. After the gunfire subsided, approximately 40 Bolsheviks lay dead, but Joseph escaped unscathed with the loot. In addition to armed robberies, Joseph also engaged in other forms of illicit fundraising, such as kidnapping the offspring of affluent locals and holding them for ransom. However, this spree of violence and intimidation soon enabled the Tsarist secret police to apprehend him, and he was eventually arrested and exiled once again. In 1912, Joseph was invited by Lenin to join the Bolshevik Central Committee, an offer he accepted. However, later that year, he was arrested once more and exiled, but he soon escaped and went underground in St. Petersburg, where he clandestinely edited the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, meaning truth. It was while working on this newspaper that Joseph began to use the pseudonym Stalin, meaning steel, by which he would be known for the remainder of his life. Indeed, it was the editorship of Pravda that brought Stalin to the attention of many Bolsheviks within the Communist Party and solidified his position as one of Lenin's right-hand men. By the outbreak of the First World War, he was one of the most influential figures in the movement. Over the ensuing years, Stalin was arrested and exiled on multiple occasions. After the First World War commenced and the situation on the front became increasingly dire, both he and his fellow exiles were conscripted into the Russian army. However, after a medical examination, he was deemed unfit for military service due to his disabled left arm. Stalin then requested permission to serve the remainder of his exile in Siberia, which was granted. However, while he was there, the February Revolution of 1917 erupted in St. Petersburg, culminating in Nicholas II being compelled to abdicate the Russian throne. He was replaced by a provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky. However, the new regime's control over the country remained relatively precarious, meaning that the influence of the far left, in the form of the Bolsheviks, continued to grow unchecked over the subsequent months. Eventually, after a series of crackdowns, Lenin secured a majority within the party to attempt a coup. In the early hours of November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks seized control of power stations in St. Petersburg, along with other vital public services, such as the telephone exchange. Subsequently, the Soviet-controlled warship Aurora, anchored off the city's shore, opened fire and surrounded the Winter Palace. This soon compelled the provisional government to surrender, signifying that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in power in Russia. They then initiated the process of consolidation. In this crackdown, Lenin utilized the newly formed Bolshevik secret police, or Cheka, to suppress anyone deemed a threat to the new regime. Estimates suggest that over 100,000 individuals were killed over the following months, many comprising Tsarist supporters, the middle class, and the intellectual elite. The capital of the newly established Russian Soviet Federative Republic was then relocated to Moscow, primarily due to its central location, and because Lenin desired to distance the new regime from St. Petersburg, which had been the Tsar's capital since the reign of Peter the Great. Despite this success, Russia remained at war with Germany and Austria, as the dilapidated Russian economy had been unable to sustain the army during the conflict, resulting in food shortages, discontent, and widespread chaos. Lenin was eager to sue for peace. Another reason for the necessity of peace was that the Bolsheviks needed to consolidate their authority over Russia, and any continuation of the war could potentially undermine their tenuous control over the nation. However, their position was soon bolstered when a ceasefire was agreed upon with Germany on December 15, 1917. Hostilities with the Central Powers formally ceased with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on March 3, 1918. Despite the conclusion of Russia's involvement in the First World War, there remained fierce resistance against Lenin's regime within the country itself. The Bolshevik seizure of power in the October Revolution had effectively unified individuals from all corners of the political spectrum against the communists, who became known as the White Russians. It was not long before conflict erupted between the two factions, igniting the conflict known to history as the Russian Civil War. This war effectively fractured Russia into dozens of regions and, in some instances, states, vying with one another for supremacy over or independence from Moscow. However, the Bolsheviks, with the assistance of Leon Trotsky, who had established a million-strong fighting force, by this time in the form of the Red Army, were eventually able, after intense fighting, to subdue the government's adversaries, as well as the intervention of foreign powers on the side of the White Russians. By the 1920s, they held the upper hand and controlled the country once again. As food and provisions were frequently scarce in Russia during the conflict, Stalin, who had returned from exile in the aftermath of the February Revolution in 1918 and had been a significant supporter in Lenin's subsequent coup, was sent to Tsaritsyn, which he would later rename Stalingrad, to procure food supplies and oversee the Red Army's campaign against the Whites in the region. During his mission of food procurement, Stalin ordered the execution of anyone who defied his directives. His tenure as the commander of the Red Army in the region was largely met with criticism from his Bolshevik party comrades, who disapproved of his strategy of deploying mass numbers of Red Army troops against the Whites, which often resulted in substantial losses. It is evident that, in their campaign against the White Russians, the Bolsheviks had begun to employ methods that far surpassed the former Tsarist regime in terms of brutality and ruthlessness. Although, to be fair, both sides in the Russian Civil War committed atrocities, it is clear that one of the most effective and relentless advocates of the communist policy of terror was Stalin. He was increasingly perceived as a hardliner within the regime, as he, more than anything, desired to eradicate resistance in all its manifestations. Perhaps the most notorious example of the increasingly ruthless approach, the Tsar and his family were riddled with bullets and then bayoneted and bludgeoned to death by their communist captors. During this period, Stalin was assigned to various military commands during the latter stages of the Russian Civil War, where he demonstrated ruthlessness in dealing with deserters. He was ultimately rewarded by the government with the Order of the Red Banner for his services to the communist cause. Shortly thereafter, Stalin was also involved in the Polish-Soviet War, which had commenced when the newly re-established Republic of Poland sought to capitalize on the state of upheaval within Russia to expand its eastern frontier. During the conflict, Stalin frequently disobeyed orders and again garnered criticism from within the Bolshevik Party for his increasingly harsh methods. However, the war eventually concluded in Poland's favor, and a peace treaty was signed shortly thereafter, as Russia remained too weak to engage in combat on multiple fronts. This treaty, combined with the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War, finally enabled them to concentrate their efforts on internal affairs. In the early years of the regime's rule, this centered around consolidating control of the country in virtually every respect. However, in the early 1920s, opposition to the Soviet regime resurfaced in the form of strikes and unrest, particularly from the country's rural population. They had by and large not been involved in the communist seizure of power and were, on the whole, supporters of the deposed Tsar or the White Russians. The Civil War had also precipitated widespread upheaval across the country itself. Although the Soviets controlled the urban centers, nearly 80% of the Russian population comprised rural peasants, whose lives and farms had been most severely impacted by the conflict. This soon led to widespread food shortages across the nation, triggering a mass exodus from Russia's northern cities as its urban population migrated south in search of sustenance. This migration posed a challenge for the Bolsheviks, as the vast majority of their supporters were industrial workers and city dwellers who were now becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the regime's inability to secure adequate food supplies. To address this issue, the Soviets intensified their policy on food requisitioning, implemented to consolidate Russian agricultural output and feed the Red Army, as well as the dwindling population of the country's urban centers, such as Moscow. However, this policy soon resulted in widespread starvation and famine across rural southern Russia, as hundreds of thousands of farmers' crops were simply confiscated, leaving both them and their families without any source of income or sustenance. This culminated in the Russian famine of 1921 to 1922, in which several million peasants perished from starvation. This dire situation then prompted Lenin in 1921 to make concessions in his new economic policy, which permitted state industry and private enterprise to coexist and replaced food requisitioning with taxation, allowing the nation's farmers to retain and sell the crops they produced. This policy was largely successful in restoring adequate food production. However, it was unpopular with certain members of the communist regime, such as Trotsky, who argued that the state should repossess all worker output, while economic moderates, such as Lenin and Stalin, favored a degree of private enterprise provided it was controlled and directed by the state. Stalin's support of Lenin had elevated him to a prominent figure within the regime by this time. In 1922, he was nominated to become the party's new general secretary, an administrative position that placed him in charge of party membership, along with disciplinary responsibilities. This role also granted Stalin a foothold in virtually every facet of Russia's governance, as after all, the party was the state and its power was highly centralized. The responsibility of Stalin's new role was dispersed across the entirety of the Soviet government, and therefore the country. This enabled him to gather intelligence on potential adversaries, and he then gradually and discreetly began to accumulate power through the ever-expanding bureaucracy, which lay at the foundation of his eventual ascent. Then in May 1922, Lenin suffered a severe stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed and bedridden. Although he remained capable of making decisions and dictating policy, Stalin, now his right-hand man, served as a conduit between him and the Council of People's Commissars. In it, he urged reform within the party's ruling elite, criticized its leaders, and recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as general secretary. This document, which Lenin desired to be read aloud at the 12th Party Congress, could have, had it ever seen the light of day. It was around this time in late December 1922 that the separate Soviet republics of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Soviet, comprising states such as Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, consented to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This union would endure until 1991 and would, with Stalin's assistance, become the second most powerful nation on Earth within a matter of decades. Lenin, however, would never witness his brainchild reach the zenith of its power as he passed away on January 21, 1924. The prominent figures within the Soviet regime then began to vie with one another for control of the Communist Party. Stalin, as general secretary, then began to position himself as one of the leading contenders to succeed his former master. Perhaps his most formidable rival in this power struggle emerged in the form of Leon Trotsky. He had joined the Bolsheviks from the Mensheviks just prior to the October Revolution of 1917 and had founded the Red Army, leading it to victory in the Russian Civil War. This made him a hero in the eyes of many within the Communist Party and solidified his position as one of Lenin's most trusted lieutenants. Initially, Trotsky appeared, at least outwardly, to be the favored successor to Lenin. However, Stalin had, over the preceding years, been leveraging his position as general secretary, which controlled party appointments, to surround himself with loyal followers who owed their promotions to him. This meant he was gradually able to wrest control of the party away from Trotsky and his allies, filling its leading positions with individuals beholden to him. Trotsky himself then began to criticize Stalin, whom he perceived as a rightist, arguing that Lenin's capitalist new economic policy should be reversed. He then began to ally himself with other prominent Bolshevik members, known as the Left Opposition and later the United Opposition, who were opposed to the General Secretary's ever-increasing grip on the Soviet Union. Stalin's position as General Secretary also conferred another advantage over his adversaries, as he now controlled the widespread bureaucracy across Russia, which provided him with information on political developments and individuals. It is certainly fair to state that even though Stalin in his early life had proven himself to be brutal and ruthless, he was also exceptionally intelligent and cunning. Stalin then capitalized on Trotsky's growing weakness and isolation within the party, aligning himself with influential individuals within the regime, many of whom owed their careers to him. Within a matter of months, his rival was alienated and excluded from the country's governance. This strategy of surrounding himself with highly effective yes men proved exceedingly effective in securing power for Stalin as well as maintaining it. However, it eventually proved counterproductive, as later in World War II, government officials and Red Army generals were terrified of making independent decisions, fearing they would provoke the boss's wrath. For the time being at least, Stalin was securely at the center of a bureaucratic spider's web, enabling him to displace his enemies from important government positions. Trotsky himself was removed as the People's Commissar of Military and Naval Affairs in January 1925 and was subsequently expelled from the Central Committee in October 1927, and later from the Soviet Union altogether in 1929. During his exile, Trotsky became the figurehead of the opposition to his old rival, authoring numerous books and articles condemning his former comrade. Ultimately, Stalin ordered his secret services to assassinate his archenemy, which succeeded after Trotsky was attacked with an ice axe by a Soviet agent at his residence in Mexico City. After being transported to a hospital, he succumbed to his injuries on August 21, 1940. Molotov would later play a pivotal role in the re-establishment of agricultural collectivization and would also, in his later capacity as Minister of Foreign Affairs, become one of the most renowned and recognized members of Stalin's inner circle, meeting with world leaders, including Hitler, in the lead-up to World War II. For some time during the 1920s, growing concerns existed that Lenin's new economic policy was excessively capitalist. There were anxieties that the peasant farmers who had benefited from Lenin's reforms were profiteering by controlling the sale of their crops. This sense of mistrust was further exacerbated by grain supplies plummeting by 70% between 1926 and 1927, prompting Stalin to revise Lenin's economic policy as he could not afford for Russia's urban centers to experience food shortages once again. Another reason for the necessity of economic change was the relative backwardness of Soviet industry, which lagged decades behind its Western rivals. And it was this, combined with the dwindling food production, that finally prompted. Stalin initiated the first of his 5-year plans from 1928 to 1932, reintroducing collectivization and prioritizing the growth of heavy industry. Over the ensuing years, this resulted in the opening of hundreds of factories, mines, and plants across the Soviet Union. This doubled the country's industrial workforce from 3 to 6 million in 5 years and increased industrial output by over 100%. This rapid and forced industrialization, arguably at the cost of tens of thousands of peasant lives, would eventually provide the Soviet Union with the industrial capacity it needed to sustain the war against Nazi Germany. Without it, the country almost certainly would not have been able to manufacture the thousands of tanks, aircraft, and other war materials required to achieve victory. Another component of Stalin's first 5-year plan was the intensification of his collectivization policy. This inevitably meant that the Soviet Union's farmers, who had hitherto enjoyed a degree of freedom or private ownership, would have to be brought under state control. These affluent farmers, known as kulaks, were a class of landowners who, through reforms in the 19th century and Lenin's new economic policy, had accumulated some wealth by being allowed to sell their crops instead of handing them over to the government on the condition that they paid taxes. This was effectively capitalism in the eyes of many within the Soviet regime. It was this perception, combined with the decline in food production and rumors of profiteering, that prompted Stalin and the Central Committee to order the seizure of the kulaks' grain supply, along with their farms, by force. Subsequently, it was declared that they were to be liquidated as a class, resulting in hundreds of thousands of arrests across the country. Estimates vary, but the number of kulaks who were either arrested, exiled to Siberia, or killed is believed to be in the hundreds of thousands, and very likely in the millions. However, this policy of arrest, exile, and eradication meant that the class of people primarily responsible for producing the majority of Russia's grain was eliminated within a few years, ultimately leading to widespread starvation and famine. The kulaks were then replaced with collectives and communes involving peasants working on the now state-owned farms. However, as those involved in this state-run agricultural system did not own the land they worked on, nor the food they produced, productivity plummeted as there were no positive incentives for the communal farmers to work diligently. Riots and uprisings then erupted across the Soviet Union in the late 1920s as a result of these policies, which were subsequently suppressed by the Red Army and the NKVD. The NKVD controlled internal affairs across the Soviet Union and would eventually be merged with the secret police in 1934, becoming Stalin's most feared instrument of terror and suppression. Some have since suggested that he was merely concerned with acquiring absolute power over the Soviet populace. However, it could also be argued that he viewed state control as a necessity to suppress ideas such as individualism, which had to be prevented to lay the groundwork for a true communist society, devoid of religion, money, and social classes. In essence, Stalin faced a choice between allowing a degree of private enterprise to persist, along with freedom of thought and speech, which would have potentially resulted in the demise of socialism and, by extension, communism itself, or enacting the principles of socialism. This inevitably meant that he would have to abolish all individual freedoms, as many individuals throughout the country simply did not desire to live under a socialist state. Capitalist historians contend that this is perhaps the greatest weakness inherent in socialism, which seeks to eliminate class structure within nations as well as private ownership, to pave the way for a true communist utopia free of money in the state. Implementing socialism is entirely contingent on the population of a given nation being willing to relinquish their private property. This has always resulted in the state having to resort to force in every country where collectivization has been attempted, arguably best exemplified by Stalin's Russia. In essence, Stalin's solution to the resistance of those who disagreed with his collectivization policies was the application of force and suppression. Everything a person thought or did was influenced and dictated by the state, and any dissent, no matter how minor, was suppressed with merciless efficiency. Stalin and his allies were, in effect, establishing the most ruthless and all-powerful dictatorship in human history, as control was absolute by the early 1930s. And external influence was non-existent. However, these policies of power centralization soon backfired in early 1932, when a particularly harsh winter in Ukraine and southern Russia, coupled with collectivized farming, resulted in an unprecedented famine that would ultimately claim the lives of nearly 3 million people. This occurred despite the fact that the grain harvest in the Soviet Union was roughly equivalent to that of 1930. However, the government's increasingly stringent grain requisitions resulted in the majority of the country's food being dispatched to its population centers, culminating in substantial food shortages in rural areas. Another cause of these shortages was Stalin's policy of selling the Soviet Union's grain supplies abroad in exchange for aid and materials for the country's industrial base, which he was endeavoring to modernize and expand at breakneck speed. Many have argued that this famine was entirely avoidable and that Stalin's redistribution policies were its direct cause. However, he himself blames subversive elements within Ukraine and southern Russia, attempting to deflect blame from himself. What then ensued is known as the Great Terror and the Great Purge, instigated following the assassination of Stalin's close friend Sergei Kirov, the head of the Communist Party in Leningrad, formerly St. Petersburg, in December 1934. Some have alleged that it was, in fact, Stalin who ordered Kirov's murder, suspecting him of disloyalty and resenting his growing popularity within the Communist Party. Regardless of the reason and the identity of the individual who issued the order, Stalin exploited his friend's death as a pretext to order the arrest and execution of anyone he deemed complicit in the incident, as well as anyone who had opposed him in preceding years. During the Great Purge, which spanned from 1936 to 1938, Stalin directed the NKVD to undertake extensive crackdowns on the Soviet populace, the Red Army, and the Communist Party itself. Potential dissidents were arrested, including numerous high-ranking government officials, who were frequently exiled or executed following public show trials. Estimates vary, but the total number of fatalities resulting from this purge is believed to be as high as 1.25 million individuals, encompassing former aristocrats, business owners, and clergymen, many of whom posed no threat whatsoever to Stalin. He even had the wives of many of his closest associates arrested and, in some instances, killed to intimidate them into submission. Another instrument in Stalin's arsenal of terror was the Gulag, a government-operated system of forced labor camps established in the early 1930s, primarily in remote areas. Individuals were sent there as punishment, and in many instances, they were worked to death. As many as 18 million people passed through the Gulag system between 1930 and 1950. But the precise number of deaths remains undetermined. However, some historians estimate the total to be approximately 1.5 million individuals. As previously mentioned, a significant aspect of Stalin's Great Purge was his liquidation of the Red Army's officer corps, instigated to eliminate any opposition within the armed forces and further consolidate Stalin's control. Hundreds of Red Army officers and generals were arrested and executed, as were former White Army soldiers from among the civilian population. The historical consensus is that this purge significantly impaired the Red Army's combat effectiveness, as many of its most skilled and intelligent individuals were arrested, exiled, or killed. This meant that when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Army's leadership had, in effect, been crippled, arguably contributing to many of the significant defeats and losses the Russians endured in the war's initial stages. By this time, Germany was an ascendant power in Europe, and Stalin was well aware of Adolf Hitler's animosity towards Bolshevism. Consequently, he began to prepare for a potential war with Germany. However, due to the Red Army purges, its capacity to engage in combat was minimal, to say the least, and its equipment, though abundant, was in many instances obsolete or in a state of disrepair. The Soviet premier then pursued a strategy of appeasement with Germany during the late 1930s, culminating in Russia signing a non-aggression pact with Germany on August 23, 1939. After Germany vanquished the Poles in their invasion 1 month later, the Soviets occupied the eastern half of Poland as arranged in the agreement between the two nations. During this occupation, the Red Army and the NKVD apprehended thousands of Polish officers who were subsequently executed on Stalin's orders, along with members of the country's intelligentsia in the Katyn massacre of April and May 1940, in which upwards of 22,000 Poles were murdered. This occupation of the western half of Poland then prompted both Britain and France to declare war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Anticipating, as many did, that the war between the Allies and the Germans would be a protracted affair. Much like World War I, Stalin offered Germany support in the form of food and oil supplies. While Germany was preoccupied with the Western powers, Stalin directed his attention towards his northern neighbor, Finland, which he perceived as an easy target. He desired to utilize the country as a buffer zone against a potential future war with Hitler, and also sought to secure naval ports for the Soviet Navy in the Baltic Sea. Stalin then endeavored to intimidate the Finns into submission by presenting their government with an ultimatum in October 1939, demanding the handover of Finland's border region to Soviet control, along with numerous Baltic islands, and allowing Soviet troops to be stationed on Finnish territory. However, the Finns rejected the Soviet demands. After negotiations collapsed, Stalin ordered a full-scale invasion of the country, which commenced on November 30, 1939. Despite the Red Army being the largest on Earth at this time, the Finns, who had constructed an elaborate defense network along their southern border, impeded the advance of Stalin's troops, inflicting approximately 250,000 casualties, while the Finns suffered only 25,000. This was perceived as a humiliation for Stalin himself, as his Red Army had been unable to overwhelm the numerically inferior Finnish army. After a peace treaty was signed in March 1940, securing the buffer zone the Soviets had desired, a rapid overhaul of the Red Army was initiated over the ensuing months, encompassing tactics, training, and equipment. Stalin, who was himself accountable for the substantial losses the Red Army had sustained, privately acknowledged that mistakes had been made in the lead-up to the war, and subsequently sought to reform the Red Army's leadership by dismissing his defense commissar, Kliment Voroshilov, and replacing him with Semyon Timoshenko. However, it could be argued that Stalin's disastrous Finnish invasion ultimately worked to his advantage, as many of the Red Army's deficiencies were identified during the conflict, enabling the Soviets to prepare for the subsequent German invasion. After they were incorporated into the Union of Soviet Republics in August 1940, widespread arrests and deportations were instigated to subdue the local populace. During his early years as Soviet premier, Stalin regarded France, and particularly Britain, as greater threats than Germany, as they had supported the White Army during the Civil War. However, as fascism, and specifically German National Socialism, began to manifest itself during the 1920s and early 1930s, the Man of Steel was compelled to take the threat of Hitler's Third Reich seriously, thus initiating the buildup of his nation's armed forces. It could also be contended that the signing of the non-aggression pact with Germany instilled in Stalin a false sense of security. He understandably calculated that a war between Germany and the Western powers would endure for years, providing him ample time to bolster his defenses, the strength of which he hoped would make Hitler reconsider initiating any conflict. Then, to both Stalin's and the world's astonishment, Germany vanquished the French and Allied forces in a mere 6 weeks between May and June 1940, culminating in the French surrender, which left Britain isolated in the war. Hitler, after failing to invade the island nation during the Battle of Britain, perhaps inevitably designated the Soviet Union as his next target. This invasion, slated to commence in the early summer of 1941, was codenamed Redbeard, or Barbarossa, after the Germanic king who had battled the Slavs in the Middle Ages. It comprised 3 massive army thrusts involving 3 million German troops, who would employ blitzkrieg, or lightning war, to encircle and annihilate Stalin's forces before advancing towards Leningrad in the north, Kiev in Ukraine, and Moscow itself. Stalin, contrary to popular misconception, received no definitive intelligence regarding Hitler's true intentions prior to the invasion's commencement, as the reports he did receive were ambiguous or unclear. Therefore, he continued to stall for time, believing the German assurances that the buildup of his troops on the Soviet border was not part of an invasion, and hoping, at worst, that they were intended to threaten him and were part of an impending ultimatum. The reality, however, was that Hitler was planning to invade the Soviet Union. He subsequently authorized the invasion by broadcasting the word Dusseldorf on the afternoon of June 21, 1941. At approximately 3:15 in the morning on June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa commenced with bombing raids on cities across the Western Soviet Union as far afield as Leningrad. Following a massive artillery barrage, Hitler's forces transgressed the Soviet border. Over the ensuing weeks, the Germans sliced through the Russians with remarkable ease, and it appeared to all, including Stalin, that catastrophic defeat was imminent. However, despite the colossal losses the Red Army sustained during Barbarossa's opening stages, which numbered in the millions, it ultimately managed to orchestrate one of the most remarkable military comebacks in human history, vanquishing Hitler's Germany once and for all. Another misconception frequently cited about Stalin is that he failed to prepare the Soviet Union for the war with Hitler. However, when one considers the fact that the Red Army in 1941 possessed the most men, tanks, and aircraft of any army in the world, the Man of Steel can hardly be accused of neglecting the country's defenses. If anything, the Soviet Red Army was excessively large or unwieldy, as resupplying and equipping it with modern equipment inevitably required time. As the Russians had never engaged in a modern, large-scale industrialized war against a major European power before, the true effectiveness of its armed forces, as well as its equipment, remained unknown at this time. It should also be recalled that the German army in 1941 had recently defeated the armies of France and Britain within a remarkably short time frame. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that the Russians succumbed to the German onslaught during Barbarossa's early stages, as they were confronting the most highly organized fighting machine in the world at that time. Since World War II, numerous theories have been advanced regarding why and how the Soviet Union triumphed over Nazi Germany. Some contend that Hitler was incompetent and simply declared war on the wrong countries at the wrong time, while others assert that it was a close contest that could have gone either way. Many frequently claim that Stalin himself was incompetent and only prevailed because he permitted his general. Therefore, it is overly simplistic to attribute blame or praise to any single individual or cite any given mistake as a pivotal moment in the conflict. Although the Soviet Union was considerably poorer than the Western powers, its greatest advantage in its war with Hitler was arguably the sheer magnitude of its population, which in the early 1940s totaled approximately 200 million individuals. Germany, on the other hand, had a population of 90 million, encompassing Austria, Czechoslovakia, and occupied Poland. More significantly, approximately 45% of the Soviet Union's population was under the age of 20 in 1941, compared to only 33% of the German population. This meant that Stalin could potentially call upon approximately 45 million men in total, if necessary, while Hitler had a maximum of approximately 15 million men of fighting age. This meant that Germany possessed a far smaller pool of potential troops to summon during the war on the Eastern Front. By 1943, both the German and Russian armies that had initiated the conflict had effectively been decimated. However, the Russians were swiftly able to replenish their lost comrades with men of fighting age, while Germany, by the war's conclusion, had to resort to reserves of men who were not of fighting age, such as children and even pensioners. These figures exclude the 800,000 women who served in the Soviet armed forces during World War II, many of whom were deployed in combat roles, including fighter pilots, bomber crews, and even snipers. One of the most renowned of these was Tatiana Kosterina, who amassed a staggering 120 kills during the war's early stages before perishing in hand-to-hand combat in 1943. She was later posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Another significant and better-known factor was geography. The Russians could afford to cede vast expanses of territory to the Germans following the invasion's commencement, which in turn stretched their supply lines to the limit. This, combined with the frigid Russian winters and the inadequate preparedness of Germany's industry to sustain a large-scale war, soon precipitated disaster. This, of course, disregards the substantial impact the Western Allies exerted on Germany during the conflict across multiple theaters, such as the blockade of Germany by Britain's Royal Navy, its Arctic convoys to Russia, the Allied bombings of Germany throughout the war, the cracking of the German Enigma codes, and the Axis defeat in North Africa, which in terms of troop losses was comparable to Stalingrad. It should also be noted that the war's initial phase in Russia was, from a German perspective, remarkably successful. The fact that the Wehrmacht maintained its combat capabilities in the Soviet Union for so long against such overwhelming odds is a testament to the aptitude of its commanders, as well as the combat prowess of its soldiers. The near-total success that Hitler's armies enjoyed during the war's early stages is as attributable to German military brilliance as it is to Soviet deficiencies. In the initial stages of Hitler's invasion, his soldiers annihilated entire Soviet divisions, who frequently surrendered by the hundreds of thousands. Following the fall of the city of Minsk a week after the invasion's commencement, Stalin was left in such a state of shock that he secluded himself for days, resulting in the paralysis of the country's government. Since World War II, much has been made of the fact that Stalin, at the war's outset at least, acted incompetently, refusing to deploy troops to his border with Germany prior to the fighting's commencement. However, it could be argued that this was the correct strategy, as Blitzkrieg's primary objective was to encircle and destroy enemy forces in the field. Therefore, Stalin's decision to withhold substantial portions of his troops in the lead-up to the invasion could be deemed the correct decision, as they would almost certainly have been eradicated in Operation Barbarossa's initial days had they been stationed closer to the German border. Additionally, recent research conducted by German military historians indicates that Soviet counterattacks inflicted severe delays and losses on the Wehrmacht in Operation Barbarossa's early stages, ultimately delaying them sufficiently to render the seizure of Moscow in 1941 unattainable. It should also be borne in mind that the German army and German industry were geared towards fighting short-term, decisive wars. Consequently, the longer Stalin could protract the conflict, the more probable a favorable outcome became, as Hitler's armies were at their strongest at the invasion's very inception. Essentially, World War II in the East was a matter of numbers, a reality Stalin came to appreciate more than anyone, certainly more than Hitler. He comprehended that the key to victory resided in manpower, efficient and abundant logistics, and perhaps most importantly, industrial capacity. An exemplary illustration of this Soviet numerical advantage in equipment was the production figures for their most celebrated tank, the T-34. The Russians were able to manufacture 35,000 of these between 1941 and 1945. These numbers were further augmented by their production of nearly 30,000 T-34-85 tanks, which were T-34s upgraded with an 85mm gun designed to engage the formidable German Panther and Tiger tanks. These figures contrast starkly with the Germans' production of approximately 50,000 tanks from the pre-war period in the mid to late 1930s until 1945. This encompassed all variants of German tank design, from the Panzerwurm, a light tank equipped with machine guns, to the colossal Tiger IIs, or King Tigers. In short, the Russians manufactured more models of a single world-class tank in 4 years than the entirety of German tank output from the mid-1930s until 1945, excluding self-propelled guns. If these are included in the figures, it signifies that the Soviets produced approximately 100,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in 4 years, while the Germans only produced around 63,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in 10 years. Furthermore, when one considers that tens of thousands of American Sherman tanks, as well as all other types of Allied tanks and self-propelled guns, were involved, The Germans were vastly outproduced and outnumbered on all fronts in terms of tanks and self-propelled guns by nearly 3-to-1. These figures also exclude aircraft, transport vehicles, food, oil, and manpower, which were limited for the Axis powers but virtually limitless for the Russians and the Western Allies. Another staggering fact about the Soviet Union during World War II was the dismantling, transportation, and reconstruction of hundreds of factories in the wake of the German invasion. This entailed entire industrial complexes being disassembled and transported by railcar, sometimes for thousands of miles to the east, where they were then reassembled, safely beyond the reach of Hitler's Luftwaffe. Soviet archives and records indicate that, in each instance, up to 10,000 railcars were required to relocate a single factory. This must have presented a colossal logistical challenge for the individuals tasked with overseeing this mass transportation, and also caused a substantial disruption to the Soviet rail network, which was already strained to its limits with transporting and supplying the Red Army, let alone the transportation of as many as 1,500 factories. In total, these astonishing figures depict a nation that was, by 1942, entirely geared towards waging a long-term industrialized war. In contrast, Hitler did not place the German economy on a total war footing until well after the war was lost. Therefore, it could be asserted that the most crucial factor in the Soviet Union prevailing against Germany was simply the fact that Stalin's regime did not collapse. It was almost entirely due to his own willpower, determination, and absolute control that continuing the struggle against Hitler's invasion was feasible, let alone achievable. In comparison, when one examines the Russian defeat in the First World War, the primary reason the country capitulated to the Germans was the collapse of the Tsarist regime itself. In contrast, in 1812, the Tsar and the Russian populace had remained steadfast in the face of Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion, and consequently prevailed. Therefore, the fact that Stalin's Russia did not collapse in 1941 and halted the German advance outside Moscow rendered victory increasingly probable. Although Stalin is rightfully deemed responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of his own people, it must be acknowledged and respected that both he and Russia itself vanquished Hitler's Germany during World War II, losing nearly 26 million troops and civilians in the process. It is difficult to envision how anyone other than Stalin could have maintained the Soviet Union's cohesion during the conflict, as his near-total control of the nation was indispensable in securing victory. This, in essence, is one of the most profound paradoxes of Stalin's Russia. Although he perpetrated some of the most heinous crimes in human history, without the resolve of the man of steel, as well as the immense sacrifices, Stalin had been aware for some time that the Americans were developing an atomic bomb, and discussions had been ongoing in the Soviet Union since the 1930s regarding the feasibility of constructing such a weapon. After the Americans delivered the coup de grace to the Japanese, with the aid of nuclear weapons in 1945, the Soviet program was significantly accelerated. In August 1949, the Russians tested their first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan. This established Soviet Russia as the world's second superpower, alongside the United States. With the two nations now confronting each other, an atomic arms race commenced in which Stalin continued to augment his nuclear and conventional forces over the ensuing years. This entailed each side creating larger and more potent nuclear bombs, ultimately leading to the development and testing of the hydrogen bomb, designated Ivy Mike, detonated by the Americans on November 1, 1952. The Soviets soon followed suit, detonating their first hydrogen bomb on November 22, 1955, codenamed RDS-37. However, Stalin would not live to witness the creation of this ultimate weapon, as his health was now deteriorating. This meant he took increasingly extended absences from government, sometimes for months at a time, and would often refuse to allow doctors to examine him. His ailments were becoming increasingly severe, and he even had several of his physicians arrested, fearing they intended to assassinate him. The Man of Steel had, in 1945 alone, suffered a minor stroke, as well as a severe heart attack, undoubtedly at least partially attributable to the immense stress he had endured over the preceding 30 years, coupled with his heavy smoking and regular alcohol consumption. Then on March 1, 1953, Stalin was discovered semi-conscious at his Volinskoe dacha. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Despite the best efforts of the available physicians, he passed away on March 5, 1953. His daughter later stated that his demise was arduous and agonizing. Joseph Stalin transitioned from being a peasant in the 19th century to one of the most powerful individuals who has ever lived in the late 1940s. In his early years, he was little more than a criminal leader, pilfering funds and eliminating his adversaries. However, by the time of his death, he had ordered the deaths of tens of millions of individuals, either through execution, forced labor, or warfare, during what many consider to be the most significant communist experiment of the 20th century. It is also asserted of him that he forsake the ideals of Marxism by consolidating control under his authority, thereby establishing a highly centralized dictatorship that solely served to augment his own power. He denied the workers any voice in the nation's governance, which remained in the hands of the few rather than the many. In opposition to this, many capitalists contend that every time socialist states have endeavored to establish true communism, the process has failed as many individuals naturally did not desire to relinquish their family's property and assets. This frequently resulted in the state having to resort to force and, in numerous instances, culminated in violence and death. This is why numerous individuals worldwide still aspire to the realization of true communism, a society predicated on communal ownership. Many believe that the transition from capitalism to socialism and subsequently to communism has never been effectuated, as many socialist governments are, perhaps inevitably, usurped by power-hungry individuals like Stalin, who deprived the workers of the right to govern their own destinies. Whether or not he was a genuine socialist, numerous historians regard Joseph Stalin as the most successful dictator in human history. Adolf Hitler, for instance, only governed Germany for 13 years, whereas Stalin conversely led Russia for nearly 3 decades, transforming the nation from the sick man of Europe into the continent's sole superpower, rivaled on the global stage only by the United States. In the contemporary world, there are still those who contend that both Stalin and Mao Zedong were justified in ordering the deaths of millions of their own people. In their view, there was no alternative means of transforming Russia and China, whose populations predominantly comprised peasants, into modern industrialized states. Other historians have countered this by asserting that there is no justification for the millions of deaths ordered by Stalin and Chairman Mao, as industrialization could have been achieved through free markets and property rights, as in the West. It is also argued that millions of deaths under communism were inevitable, as there was no other method of terminating capitalism and property rights in Soviet Russia or Maoist China other than the application of force. As the state controlled every facet of life, reducing the populace to near-slave status and suppressing all opposition to the abolition of private property was imperative to compete with the advanced Western nations. In his youth, Joseph Stalin harbored a profound animosity towards the oppression of the Tsarist regime. However, in the end, he epitomized the Orwellian observation that those intent on overturning society's hierarchical structure frequently seek power for themselves when presented with the opportunity. Ultimately, the Man of Steel established a state that was authoritarian in its foundation and far more terrifying than anything those residing under the Tsarist Empire could have ever envisioned. No one possesses a precise understanding of the number of deaths for which Joseph Stalin is accountable. Conservative estimates range from 20 to 30 million, while others posit the figure to be considerably higher. Regardless of the true figure, there is minimal dispute that Joseph Stalin was one of the 3 most prolific mass murderers in human history, alongside Adolf Hitler and Mao Zedong. In the West, we tend to believe we played a significant role in defeating Nazi Germany, which in many respects is accurate. However, it is widely acknowledged that it was the Soviet Union and its people who vanquished Nazi Germany and prevailed in World War II in Europe. Despite incurring substantial losses, the nation still possessed the largest army globally when the conflict concluded and dominated the geopolitical landscape for the subsequent 50 years. This provides an indication of the ruthlessness of Stalin's Russia, and it is unsurprising that he remains regarded as a hero in Russia today. After all, he oversaw the defeat of Hitler's Germany and transformed the Soviet Union into the superpower it remained until 1991. In summation, Joseph Stalin was an intelligent, industrious, ruthless pragmatist who annihilated every adversary who dared to oppose him during his lifetime. In doing so, he constructed the most potent and all-encompassing dictatorship in history, ordering the deaths of millions and ultimately evading accountability. What are your perspectives on Joseph Stalin? Was he the gold standard of dictators, or a hero who precipitated the downfall of Hitler's Germany and transformed his nation into a superpower? Kindly share your thoughts in the comments section, and until next time, we extend our sincere gratitude for watching.